A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, bail laws are again under the spotlight after the alleged murders of 3 people, including a young pregnant mother in rural New South Wales. The alleged gunman is still on the run and was on bail at the time for domestic violence offences. So exactly how do bail laws work and do they need another overhaul? Those details in just a moment. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Tuesday, the 27th of January. A 31-year-old man has been charged after an improvised explosive device was allegedly thrown into a crowd at an Invasion Day rally in Perth yesterday. At the time of recording, the Perth man is set to face court later today, charged with intent to do harm in such a way as to endanger life, health or safety, and with making or possessing explosives under suspicious circumstances. Police allege the homemade device was designed to detonate upon impact but failed to do so. Here is WA Police Commissioner Cole Blanche describing the device to the media.
Contained ball bearings, contained screws, and those items were wrapped around an unknown at this stage liquid in a glass container.
Police believe the man acted alone and have reassured the community there is no ongoing threat. Meantime, a Sydney man accused of going on an anti-Semitic tirade at a March for Australia rally yesterday has been denied bail. 31-year-old Brandon Koshel appeared in court via audio-visual link, charged with publicly inciting hatred on the grounds of race causing fear. He will return to court early next month. A federal watchdog has found Services Australia deliberately broke the law for 6 years over child support payments. The Commonwealth Ombudsman compared this latest case to the robo-debt scandal, adding both Services Australia and the Department of Social Services failed to act reasonably, leaving thousands of parents affected with debts ranging from $60 to $10,000. The Ombudsman says the agency knew new laws passed in 2008 and 2018 technically made some low custody parents eligible for payments, but continued applying the old policy. A controversial British-Israeli influencer who has called for the ban of Islam has had his visa cancelled by the Australian government. Sami Yahoud was scheduled to deliver a number of talks and self-defence training sessions across the country before his visa was revoked just hours before he was set to depart. Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke has released a statement saying spreading hatred is not a good reason to come. Mr Yahoud has previously described Islam as, quote, a murderous ideology. He took to social media accusing the government of censorship following the cancellation.
I'm going to head back to Israel and I'm going to work 10 times as hard as I've ever worked. I am not turned away, as it may literally seem. I have been spurred on. The gasoline has been added to the fire, and I'm telling you now, the Australian government, a tyranny which seems very similar to one that I know from the UK, does not know what they have started.
The visa was cancelled under existing powers just days after Parliament expanded the minister's authority to block people linked to hate or extremist conduct. Record-breaking temperatures continue to hit large parts of South Australia and Victoria, with temperatures in some regions hitting 49 degrees. A large bushfire is spreading in Victoria's southwest, with a number of local towns evacuated. Play has also been suspended on outside courts at the Australian Open. And Australia's top ChatGPT searches have been revealed. New research from OpenAI shows the most common use of ChatGPT in Australia is planning special meals for friends and family, with nearly 2/3 of users asking for help with recipes, cooking tips and meal ideas. The survey of more than 1,000 adults also found strong demand for home renovation advice, budgeting assistance and drafting emails. The findings come as the federal government prepares to establish an Australian AI Safety Institute amid growing use of the technology across the country. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on bail laws after 3 people were shot dead last week at Lake Cargellico in far western New South Wales. The alleged offender, Julian Ingram, who is still on the run, was on bail at the time for domestic violence offences, including against his ex-partner, who was heavily pregnant and allegedly shot dead by Ingram. It comes less than 2 years after Molly Ticehurst was murdered in nearby Forbes by her former partner, Daniel Billings. He was on bail for 3 counts of rape and stalking or intimidating the 28-year-old young mother. Molly's death sparked a major overhaul of bail laws in New South Wales, but now there are concerns there are still dangerous loopholes. Joining us to explain exactly how bail laws work and what more needs to be done is criminal law expert Professor Julia Quilter from the University of Wollongong. And a warning, this discussion contains descriptions of domestic violence that may be distressing for some listeners. Julia, in regards to recent events, there has been a lot of focus on bail laws. We have seen promises from the New South Wales government that they would tighten bail laws. Can you explain exactly how bail laws work in New South Wales?
So bail laws are basically a procedural mechanism in order to ensure that somebody turns up to face charges. So it's not about punishment, it's about a procedural mechanism which ensures that the presumption of innocence is first and foremost at the front of these kinds of matters. Now, that said, it's recognised that certain risks may be associated with allowing somebody to get bail. And they can be things like whether or not the person is at risk of committing further serious offences or whether they may endanger the other persons or witnesses in relation to the matter. So bail laws around the country and specifically in New South Wales have particular regimes that need to be followed by a bail authority who is making one of these decisions to determine what risks and concerns there might be in relation to this particular individual. And in New South Wales, for example, and it's mirrored across Australia, there are actually steps that need to occur. So first, assessing those bail concerns, whether or not the person's going to turn up, whether or not they're going to commit serious offences, and whether or not they're going to endanger victims or the community in some way. And then we need to look at whether or not those risks are unacceptable. And there are certain mandated things under legislation that need to be focused on by the bail decision maker. That's in the majority of cases. In other, what we might call more serious cases, there is a first step before we get to unacceptable risk, and that relates to what are called show cause offences. And these came in 2014 in changing bail laws to make them more difficult, in a sense, for certain categories of crimes for a person charged with those to get bail. And what the person needs to demonstrate is that they are, in fact, it would be unjustified in order to allow them to get bail. But it's only certain serious types of offences that have that first step. If they can then demonstrate that, then we move on to unacceptable risk. So that's the kind of overall way in which bail laws operate in New South Wales. And there are mirrors of a similar kind of mechanism across Australia.
Time and time again, Julia, we hear of circumstances where serious crimes are committed and then it's revealed later that the offender was out on bail at the time, or in cases that are currently before the judge or pending, alleged offences. So in regards to the question is asked, are they really effective and keeping serious criminals off the streets that cause serious harm or in some circumstances death to others?
Look, I think it's always important whenever there is a tragic incident like the ones that we've seen in recent times to assess whether or not we have the settings right in relation to bail laws. But I think it's important to remember that literally hundreds of bail decisions are made every week, and the majority of those do not lead to serious offences being committed. We simply couldn't actually hold on remand everybody who is charged with a particular type of offence. And in addition, of course, there are large delays and it's very costly to keep people on remand. And that's why we have particular categories of offences that are perhaps more serious, we could call them that, for which this show cause step in the bail proceedings needs to take effect. So they are very tight, the laws in New South Wales, and indeed we've had multiple legislative amendments over the years to really decrease access to bail, and often after big events and tragic incidents like the ones that have occurred in recent times, to ensure that we've got those dynamics right in making bail decisions.
In recent events, Julia, we know one of the alleged offenders had actually met the strict bail conditions. So under the eyes of the law, there was nothing that alleged offender had done to break his bail conditions.
So in terms of the bail decision itself, because this wasn't a matter where there were show cause offences, the magistrate who was presiding over that particular matter didn't actually have to look at whether or not their detention would be unjustified. They needed to look at unacceptable risk. And there are a range of things that they should look at there, including any history of violence, whether or not there's been compliance, for example, with former or past or current AVOs. Those sorts of things are quite necessary to look at. But in an instance where you don't necessarily have a history of non-compliance with an AVO or a history of violence, then there may be less reason to ensure that that person is held on remand, and you may set strict conditions for them to be released back into the community.
We know the world is never going to be perfect, Julia, but in regards to the victims that are killed, they would say this is one too many scenarios where the bail system hasn't worked. How do you think we can make it better so that no one slips through the cracks to ensure everyone is safe?
Look, sadly, I don't think we can ever get a system that's 100% accurate, because what you have to do with a bail decision is to assess risk. You're effectively requiring magistrates to look into the future and assume what might happen. That said, I think that there are certain areas that we know where recidivism occurs, and domestic violence is one of those areas. We know that people who have been charged with domestic violence offences and or have a history of domestic violence or breaches of AVOs are likely to be ones who will again commit these types of offences. So I do think there needs to be a very strong focus in any bail decision about whether any of those red flags are there. And not just in relation to domestic violence offences, we also know that there can be patterns of associated behaviour. And some of those, for example, are known to be things like cruelty to animals that are in the charge of that particular past intimate partner's care. So there are a range of things that I think need to be looked at, but I do think the government needs to look very carefully at domestic violence. I guess I'm somebody who's usually suggesting that our remand population is too high and that perhaps we have one of the hardest bail regimes in the country, but I think around domestic violence, time and time again, we are seeing too many tragic matters like the ones that we have seen in recent days.
Julia, in regards to family and domestic violence, do you think, considering recent events and every single year and every single month we're talking about how many people die at the hands of an intimate partner, I think it's already been 4 women this year and we haven't even finished January. Do you think we need to look at ankle monitoring scenarios or tougher restrictions within that bail? So therefore, if they're charged with a domestic violence scenario, there are tougher restrictions around their bail?
This is something that government looked at back in 2024 after the tragic death of Molly Ticehurst, and certainly there are certain categories of offences, those more serious ones, the show cause offences, where, for instance, a person is charged either with what is known as coercive control, or alternatively a serious domestic violence offence. And so they're matters that have a 14-year or maximum, so they're not breaching an AVO. They're very serious types of matters, serious offences of assault, sexual assault, the most serious forms of strangulation. If a person is to be charged with that type of offence and then is to be released, one of the conditions will be electronic monitoring. So that has happened. The problem is that, of course, the majority of these types of matters are not in those serious categories of offences. So they're neither having to address that show cause provision about showing why their detention is unjustified, and nor would there be a mechanism for imposing electronic monitoring as a condition of bail.
Can you explain that to me, Julia, in regards to the seriousness of the level of domestic violence? Isn't domestic violence just domestic violence?
Well, in legislation, so what we did after one of the changes that the government made after the Molly Ticehurst death was to introduce a show cause offence known as a serious domestic violence offence. And in law, that has to be an offence that the person is charged with that carries a maximum of 14 years imprisonment. So as you might know, there are certain offences that, say, for instance, a person might be charged with, like common assault, which only have a 2-year maximum. Now, they may be offences that are committed in a domestic violence setting, but they don't meet an offence that has a maximum of 14 years. So that's why these laws don't apply to the majority of offenders or potential offenders who have been charged with offences in the context of a domestic violence setting.
So that wouldn't be applicable for anyone charged with intimidation or stalking. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So do you think there needs to be more investigation in regards to that loophole that someone may say in hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, that if they show this pattern of behaviour before, that we need to tighten those regulations?
Well, I certainly think in domestic violence, we do need to be very cautious and careful when we're making bail decisions. And I'm sure that most magistrates are very careful in doing that. Any history of domestic violence and any history of breaching an AVO will be something that must be taken into account when determining whether bail should be given to this particular individual. And indeed, where there are certain types of offences that are alleged to have occurred here, the magistrate is required to seek the views of victims and their family before they undertake whether or not they should give that person bail. And that was, again, another change that was introduced after Molly Ticehurst's death back in 2024. So the government has looked at this area. The problem is about setting where we need to be. And so electronic monitoring is obviously expensive, and we only should be targeting the particular persons who are really at the most risk of reoffending with that type of monitoring and those types of conditions. So we know that in New South Wales, there's something like 50,000 ADVOs issued each year. That's a large number of AVOs being issued. There are about more than 100,000 in place at any one time in New South Wales. We can't electronically monitor every single one of those individuals. So we need to look more closely at the risks that each potential person, raises.
Really appreciate you joining us, Julia. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
That was Professor Julia Quilter. And if this discussion raised any issues or concerns, you can contact 1800-RESPECT. That number is 1800-737-732. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning with a deep dive on how celebrities, including Meghan Trainor, are shaping the surrogacy debate. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.